My name is Ethan Kams, and I'm doing my thesis on globalization and its impact on the spread of soccer and baseball throughout the world. I was interested in these topics because when we were tasked with finding subjects for the thesis, it was during the lead in to the World Cup. I was already paying close attention to development in the international soccer world, including news articles about decisions being made by some high profile athletes about which countries they would choose to represent in the World Cup. Simultaneously, there had been discussions about how Major League Baseball may switch to an international draft for integrating young talent from Latin American countries, including the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, and Colombia. Those sports have always been passions of mine, and I was curious how globalization impacted the development of those sports, as well as the countries they've been introduced to. To understand globalization's deep ties to soccer in Africa, it is important to understand the history of soccer and how it was brought over to African countries during European colonization in the mid-1800s. The first soccer games were played in Africa in the 1860s in South Africa, but by the 1930s it had already spread tremendously in terms of popularity. At first, almost every country in Africa had their own domestic soccer leagues, but they would eventually be turned obsolete as European teams began to massively outspend them. Soccer is now the most popular sport in Africa and is played from the top of the continent to the bottom. Not everything about the spread of soccer has been positive, as the increase in popularity of the sport has led to some looking to take advantage of the talent in the continent. Many people who are unqualified to coach have seen the economic potential of opening an academy, with an estimated 500 unlicensed academies having been opened across Africa. Unfortunately, these academies have created a hotbed for evil and illegal activity, as these academy managers often control every aspect of these young athletes' lives. There have been many cases of fraud and mistreatment of athletes, including some extremely serious cases where teenagers were promised soccer tryouts overseas but instead were taken as part of human trafficking operations. Since soccer has grown in Africa, there have been multiple rule changes to reflect the increased popularity and talent in the continent. In the first World Cup in 1930, there was only one African team invited. That number has steadily increased over the years and is going to reach a potential of 9 slots in the 2026 World Cup. Other rule changes have completely changed the landscape of professional soccer in Europe. One rule change was in the Bosman ruling in 1994, where it was ruled that players could now transfer teams for no fee at the end of their contracts. Another change was in the elimination of the 3+2 rule in 1996, which had limited the number of international players allowed on the roster for European teams. The combination of these rules have led to an explosion of African talent in Europe over the last few decades. Because of increased talent and the aforementioned rule changes, the number of African soccer players has dramatically increased since the mid-1990s. As this graph shows, the number of international players in European leagues almost doubled from 1996 to 2006. The unfortunate side effect of the poaching of elite talent has been the destruction of many domestic leagues within Africa, leading to less soccer jobs available overall. There is often a difficult transition for soccer players coming from Africa, as there have been some well-documented racism against black players. It has also created some interesting decisions for players who have dual nationality and has created a lot of controversy for players with familial ties to certain countries and which countries they choose to represent. As far as baseball and its connection to globalization, baseball was spread to Latin America quickly after its creation in the mid to late 1800s. Originally spread to Cuba, the sport grew across Latin America after exposure from Cuban sugar moguls across the rest of Latin America. When Major League Baseball was first created, there were numerous Cuban players in the major leagues. During the color barrier in MLB, when African Americans and Afro-Latinos were not able to play in Major League Baseball, baseball was still extremely popular in Latin America, and many players played in the United States Negro Leagues or domestically in their own country's leagues. Baseball is more popular today in Latin America than it ever has been. MLB teams have taken notice of the talent boom in the last few decades and have spent tremendous resources in the arms race to scout and train new talent in Latin America. Each team has a fully sized academy in the Dominican, and many teams have academies in other Latin American countries as well. Pictured is the Miami Marlins' new academy, which just wrapped up development in 2022 after costing a whopping $15 million. While players don't move to these academies until they are officially signed with the new teams, before their signing, they are often working closely with their coaches. These coaches are called buscones and control their finances and contract negotiations as well. Many buscones have been known to be corrupt and take kickbacks from certain teams in order to get players to sign with them. In order to solve this corruption, there have been discussions about a rule change which would level the playing field between American prospects and international ones. Currently, baseball players from the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico are subject to an amateur draft. Conversely, international prospects are all signed as free agents. While international signing can take place as early as 16, with most deals being completed off the table years earlier, the amateur draft requires you to be at least 18. Many players are much older than 18, and a decent percentage have already gone to college. There have been discussions in recent years to implement an international amateur draft, but it has been met with major pushback from Major League Baseball's Players Association. The investment the teams have placed in their academies have certainly paid dividends in regard to the product on the field. In the opening day rosters for the 2023 MLB season, there were 269 players born outside of the United States, out of the 780 players in the league. The Dominican Republic had the most of any other country, with over 13% of the MLB coming out of the DR. Other countries that contributed multiple players into MLB were Venezuela, Cuba, and Mexico. This number will only increase as these academies grow and the training and funding gets better. This change is already being represented in the minor leagues, where over 25% of the players are from the Dominican. After concluding my research, it was clear there were many similarities between the two sports and their connections to globalization. It is true there is tremendous passion for the sports where the games have been introduced, but there have also been some drawbacks to these introductions. In both sports, there is not enough care being given to young athletes who are training at these academies, especially for the ones who get injured or end up not having a professional career in sports. Similarly, it is clear that in both sports the rules are malleable when they need to be, if it results in putting the best product on the field and receiving the most viewers. Despite these drawbacks, it is clear these sports are going to continue to grow globally, and professional leagues in Europe and the United States will continue to be more diverse over the next few decades.